James Miller sat silently in his car, parked outside the brick building of a small orphanage on the south side of Chicago. He glanced at the rearview mirror, noting the tired lines on his face and the way his once bright eyes had dulled over the years. Every year, without fail, he made this same journey on the same date. Today marked 9 years since Rebecca, his beloved wife, had vanished without a trace. For James, this ritual of giving back had become his only way to honor her memory, a lifeline he clung to that connected him, however faintly, to the love he had lost. Steeling himself, James stepped out of the car. Pulling his coat tightly around him as a biting Chicago wind swept down the street. The smell of fresh rain lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of exhaust from passing cars. He made his way up the steps, noting the familiar creak of the old wood beneath his polished shoes, a sound that had marked each of his visits here. Inside, the orphanage was warm, filled with the subtle aroma of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet. Cookies, perhaps. Mrs. Wilkes, the orphanage director, greeted him at the door with her usual warm smile, her eyes crinkling at the edges. She had come to expect his visit, and though she didn't pry, James knew she respected the quiet devotion he showed each year. "Thank you again for coming, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. "The children always look forward to this." James nodded, barely able to return her smile as his gaze swept over the bustling common room. Children of all ages were gathered around tables, playing games or reading, their laughter filling the space with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the hollow ache he carried within him. But then, across the room, his eyes landed on a young girl sitting quietly by herself. She couldn't have been older than 9, with dark curly hair that framed her small face, and a serious expression that seemed unusual for a child her age. She was absorbed in a book, oblivious to the noise around her. But it wasn't just her stillness or her eyes, which glinted a familiar shade of deep green that drew him in. It was the delicate silver locket resting against her chest. Half hidden by the collar of her sweater, James's heart skipped a beat, his gaze fixed on that pendant as if he'd seen a ghost. It was identical to the one he'd given Rebecca on their first wedding anniversary, a small silver locket engraved with a discreet pattern along the edges. He remembered how Rebecca had laughed that night, twirling it around her neck as she teased him for his romantic streak. It was a symbol of their love, their promise to always find each other, no matter what. Compelled by an inexplicable force, James moved toward the girl, his footsteps echoing softly on the worn wooden floor. His palms were damp, his heartbeat loud in his ears. He hesitated, unsure how to approach her. She looked up, her gaze steady and curious, though there was a guardedness in her eyes, as if she'd learned not to expect too much from the adults who came and went. "Hi there," James managed, his voice softer than he intended. "What's your name?" The girl blinked, taking in the sight of him with a calmness that surprised him. "Ava," she replied simply, her voice clear and steady, with just a hint of curiosity. "Ava," he repeated, trying to keep his voice level despite the emotions churning inside him. "That's a beautiful name." His gaze flicked again to the pendant around her neck, and he swallowed hard. "That's a lovely locket you have. Do you know where it came from?" Ava's small fingers wrapped protectively around the locket, her eyes dropping to the floor as she shrugged. It's all I have from before," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I don't really know anything about it." James felt a strange pang of protectiveness, something he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to ask her more, but he held back, sensing that pressing her too much could make her withdraw. She was, after all, just a child, and he was still a stranger to her. Just then, Mrs. Wilkes approached, noticing James's interest in Ava. "She's a special girl." "Mr. Miller," she said, glancing affectionately at the young girl. "Ava came to us when she was just a baby, left on the steps of a church in New York City, with no note, no name, no family looking for her. It was a miracle she was even found." James's heart pounded louder, his pulse quickening as he tried to comprehend this revelation. New York City, the very city where Rebecca had disappeared all those years ago. He felt as if a door had opened, as if he'd been given a glimpse into a mystery he had long ago given up hope of solving. "She's been here ever since," Mrs. Wilkes continued, oblivious to James's inner turmoil. "Smart as a whip, that one, but no one has ever come looking for her." James glanced back at Ava, who had returned to her book, seemingly unfazed by their conversation. But he couldn't shake the feeling that fate had led him here today, to this very moment, to this very child. As he left the orphanage that day, his mind was awash with questions. But one thing stood out clearly amidst the fog of uncertainty. He needed to know more about Ava, about her past, and above all, he needed to find out if this little girl, who wore his wife's locket and looked at him with the same green eyes that had captivated him all those years ago, could somehow be his own daughter. The drive back to his empty house felt longer than usual. The city lights blurred in the rain as James gripped the steering wheel, his mind replaying the encounter with Ava over and over. That locket, her eyes. There was no denying the uncanny resemblance to Rebecca. Memories he had tried to keep buried began to resurface, pulling him back to a time when his life was filled with laughter and warmth. When he reached his house, James slumped into his favorite armchair in the dimly lit study, his eyes drifting to a framed photo on the bookshelf. It was from their last anniversary, barely a month before Rebecca's disappearance. She had insisted on celebrating simply, just the two of them, and he had given her the locket she wore that night. It was the same locket that now hung around Ava's neck. James leaned forward, cradling his head in his hands, after years of building up a wall around his heart, avoiding every painful reminder of Rebecca. He now found himself faced with a mystery that shattered the numbness he had forced upon himself. He felt something stirring in him, a spark of hope. However fragile, could Ava truly be connected to Rebecca? Could this be the answer he had been praying for? The missing piece he had spent nearly a decade searching for? Sleep evaded him that night. Instead, he paced around the house, unable to shake the image of Ava, that small, solemn face with eyes that felt hauntingly familiar. Around 3 a.m., unable to resist any longer, he reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Elliot," he said, when a groggy voice answered on the other end. "It's James Miller." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "James, it's been a while. You know it's the middle of the night, right?" James hesitated, feeling a wave of uncertainty, but he pushed forward. "I need your help, Elliot. There's something I need you to look into." Elliot was a private investigator James had worked with in the past. Back when he had first started looking for answers after Rebecca's disappearance, James had exhausted every lead, every possibility back then, and when all hope seemed lost, he had finally let go. But tonight, standing in the dark of his study, he felt that familiar determination returning. "I met a girl," James continued, the words tumbling out faster than he could process them. "She's 9 years old, lives in an orphanage in Chicago. She has a locket that's identical to the one I gave Rebecca, and her eyes, Elliot, they look just like hers." Elliot was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. "You think she could be related?" "Maybe," James replied, barely able to keep his voice steady. "I don't know, but I need to find out. I need to know where she came from, how she got there, and I need to know if she's somehow connected to Rebecca." After a pause, Elliot spoke again, his tone cautious yet resolute. "All right, James, I'll take a look, see what I can dig up. But you know this could take time, especially if it involves digging through old adoption records, foster files, maybe even police reports." "I understand," James replied, already feeling a sense of relief. "I'll cover any cost, just do whatever it takes." The days that followed were a whirlwind of anticipation and anxiety. James threw himself into his work during the day, keeping himself busy to avoid thinking about the endless what-ifs. But every evening, he found himself poring over the few photos he had of Rebecca, comparing them to his memories of Ava's face, her serious gaze, her shy smile, her curly hair. All these little details gnawed at him, creating an ache he couldn't ignore. Finally, after nearly a week of agonizing silence, Elliot called. "I found something, James," he said, his voice tight with a mix of excitement and caution. Ava was left on the steps of a church in New York City as a baby. She had no identifying documents, nothing to hint at who her parents were. James felt a chill run down his spine. New York City, the same place Rebecca had disappeared from. His grip tightened on the phone as he struggled to process the information. "That's where Rebecca went missing," he whispered, more to himself than to Elliot. "Exactly," Elliot replied. It's a strange coincidence, to say the least, and it gets even stranger. The records show that she was left there in early September, the same month Rebecca vanished. James was silent, a myriad of emotions crashing over him. Could this be true? Could Ava actually be the daughter he and Rebecca never knew they had? The thought seemed absurd, yet the pieces were lining up in ways he couldn't ignore. What do we do next? James asked, his voice barely a whisper. I'll keep digging, Elliot replied. But James, I have to warn you. These things don't always end the way we hope. It's possible she's not who we think she is. I understand, James replied, though he wasn't sure he believed his own words. Just keep me updated. Hanging up, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whether or not Ava was his daughter, he couldn't walk away from this. He needed to know the truth, to explore every possible avenue, to follow every lead. For so long, he had been haunted by the mystery of Rebecca's disappearance, by the ache of not knowing. But now, with Ava as a possible link to the past, he felt that he might finally be on the path to finding closure. That night, as he lay in bed, a strange peace washed over him. Despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a life where he might find the family he'd lost, a life where he wasn't so alone. With a small, tentative smile, James closed his eyes, letting himself drift into a dream where Rebecca and Ava were waiting for him, ready to fill the empty spaces in his heart once again. James's morning started with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. He moved through his routines quickly, his mind already on the call he'd make to Elliot later in the day. Each hour that passed felt like an eternity, as he wondered what new discoveries might unfold. The details Elliot had found were already swirling in his mind. Ava had been left on the steps of a church in New York City, the very place Rebecca had disappeared. The timing, the location, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. As soon as he stepped into his office, he made the call. Elliot, James greeted, not even attempting small talk. Anything new? Actually, yes, Elliot replied, his voice holding a tone of intrigue. I've been digging through some old archives, church records and foster records. It's thin, but I managed to track down the night Ava was found. The church had a charity event, and there were a few eyewitness accounts of a woman leaving quickly with a bundle in her arms. They remember it because she seemed distressed. Distressed, James repeated, trying to imagine what might have happened that night. Did anyone get a good look at her? Unfortunately, no one saw her clearly. It was late, and the witnesses were a bit unreliable. But there's something else. Elliot's voice grew more serious. One of the women who spoke to the police back then described a woman with dark hair, wearing what she called an expensive coat, not the kind you see around here often. James's heart raced. Rebecca had always favored classic, high-quality pieces, clothing that wouldn't stand out in their circles but might look unusual in other areas. Do you think? James trailed off, almost afraid to voice his suspicions aloud. It's possible, James, Elliot replied, his voice cautious. There's still so much we don't know, but it's possible this woman could have been Rebecca. James clenched his jaw, trying to steady himself. The idea of Rebecca in distress, leaving Ava alone on a church step, was almost too much to bear. Why would she do that if Ava is ours? Why would she abandon her? Elliot sighed on the other end. It's hard to say. Desperation makes people do things that wouldn't make sense otherwise. Maybe she was in danger or thought Ava would be safer that way. James felt a chill run down his spine. For 9 years, he'd imagined countless scenarios that could explain Rebecca's disappearance, each one darker than the last, but none of them had ever involved a child. James, I'm going to dig deeper into hospital records and see if any birth records or incidents from that time line up with what we know, Elliot said, bringing James back to the present. It might take a while, but it's our best shot at finding something concrete. Thank you, Elliot, James replied, his voice laced with both relief and gratitude. I owe you more than I can say. Don't thank me yet, Elliot said with a chuckle. Let's see where this leads us. After hanging up, James leaned back in his chair, a swirl of emotions washing over him. His mind drifted back to the day he had last seen Rebecca, how she had kissed him goodbye with her usual warmth, her eyes filled with unspoken love. He'd never imagined that would be the last time he'd see her, and now, This possibility that she had left behind not just a memory, but a child who might be their own, was both terrifying and thrilling. He couldn't ignore the pull in his heart to see Ava again. There was something about her, a presence, a familiarity that resonated deep within him. Deciding to visit the orphanage, he cleared his afternoon schedule and drove over, his heart pounding with each mile closer to the truth. When he arrived, Mrs. Wilkes greeted him with a curious look. "Back so soon, Mr. Miller. You must be very taken with our Ava." James managed a soft smile, masking the turmoil in his mind. "She's remarkable. There's something special about her. I thought I might spend some more time with her today, if that's all right." Mrs. Wilkes nodded warmly. "Of course, Mr. Miller. She's in the playroom. I'm sure she'll be happy to see you." James followed her directions, his steps quickening as he neared the room. Inside, he found Ava sitting on the floor, her small frame hunched over a puzzle, her fingers carefully fitting the pieces together. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a mixture of surprise and delight. "Hi, Mr. Miller," she said shyly, setting aside the puzzle piece she'd been holding. "Hello, Ava," he replied, trying to keep his tone casual despite the surge of emotion in his chest. "Mind if I join you?" She nodded, gesturing for him to sit next to her. For a few moments, they worked on the puzzle in comfortable silence, James occasionally glancing at her, marveling at the ease he felt in her presence. Her focus and determination reminded him so much of Rebecca. After a while, he couldn't resist asking, "Ava, do you remember anything from before you came here?" Ava looked thoughtful, her gaze drifting down. "Not really, Mrs. Wilkes told me I was just a baby when I came, so I don't remember much." She paused, fingering the pendant around her neck. "Just this locket. I've had it for as long as I can remember." James's breath caught, his heart heavy with a mix of sorrow and hope. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain why he felt such a connection to her, but he held back, not wanting to overwhelm her with his own uncertainty. "You know," he said gently, "sometimes things are given to us to remind us of who we are, even if we don't understand it right away." Ava looked at him, her eyes wide and filled with a glimmer of curiosity. "Do you think this locket means something?" James managed a smile, nodding. "Yes, Ava, I believe it means something very important." As they continued to work on the puzzle, a quiet understanding settled between them, a bond that neither of them fully understood but couldn't deny. James left the orphanage that day feeling closer to a truth he couldn't yet see, a future he wasn't yet ready to face. But one thing was certain, he couldn't let this go. Ava, in ways he couldn't yet explain, was already becoming a part of his heart, and he knew he would stop at nothing to find the answers that would give both of them the peace they sought. The days that followed brought a new rhythm to James's life, one he hadn't anticipated. Almost every afternoon, he found himself returning to the orphanage, making excuses to visit, staying longer than he'd originally planned. Ava would be there, always with that shy smile, slowly opening up as he spent time with her. It wasn't long before she started waiting for him by the door, her face lighting up whenever he walked in. Each visit chipped away at the walls around his heart, allowing a flicker of hope and joy to creep in where there had only been emptiness. They spent hours together, sometimes talking, sometimes just sharing the comfortable silence as they worked on puzzles or played games. James found himself fascinated by her personality, the quiet strength, the kindness in her eyes, her resilience. She was mature beyond her years, a quality he couldn't help but admire. She reminded him so much of Rebecca, in ways he hadn't expected, but it was the small, subtle things, the way she tilted her head when she listened, the sparkle in her eyes when she laughed, that tugged at his heartstrings the most during one of his visits. As they sat in the orphanage's small library, Ava looked up at him with a curious expression. "Mr. Miller, why do you come here so often?" James hesitated, unsure of how to answer. How could he explain the sense of connection he felt, the feeling that he was meant to protect her, to know her? "Well," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I guess I like being here, and I like spending time with you." Ava blushed slightly, looking down at her hands. "I like spending time with you too," she whispered. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, before she lifted her gaze again, this time with a hint of mischief. "I think you're nicer than you look," she teased, grinning at him. James chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Is that so? Well, thank you, Ava. I'll take that as a compliment." But behind his light-hearted words, a storm of emotions brewed. He could feel himself growing more attached to her each day, and the need to uncover her past felt more urgent than ever. Every little moment he spent with Ava deepened his resolve to understand her story, to find out if the connection he felt was real or just wishful thinking. A few days later, Elliot called with an update. "James, I've been able to track down a few more details. Nothing concrete yet, but I found some oddities in the records. It seems Ava's arrival at the orphanage was never properly documented." James's brow furrowed as he leaned back in his office chair, absorbing the information. "What does that mean?" "Well," Elliot continued, "it means someone went out of their way to avoid leaving a trail. I looked through the official adoption records, and Ava's file has gaps. Things that don't add up, for instance. There's no record of the church formally placing her with the orphanage, and no record of a police report from the night she was found. Why would someone want to hide her identity?" James asked, feeling a growing unease. "It's hard to say," Elliot replied, his tone cautious. "But I've seen this kind of thing before. It's often linked to families trying to erase a child's past for various reasons. Sometimes it's done to protect the child. Other times, it's to protect themselves." James felt a chill run down his spine. Could Rebecca have been involved in something she needed to escape from? The thought was unthinkable, but he couldn't ignore the questions piling up. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "Keep looking, Elliot. I need to know everything." As the days turned into weeks, James continued his regular visits to the orphanage, becoming a familiar presence in Ava's life. The other children even began to greet him enthusiastically, but his focus was always on her. During one of their quiet moments, he noticed her looking wistfully out the window, watching other families play in the nearby park. "Do you ever wish you had a family?" he asked softly. Ava shrugged, her fingers playing absent-mindedly with her locket. "Sometimes, but it's okay. I have Mrs. Wilkes. And my friends here." Her words, spoken so casually, struck James with an unexpected sadness. She was trying to be brave, but he could sense the longing beneath her calm facade. It reminded him of his own quiet desperation for answers, for family, for connection. "Ava," he said gently, "if you could have a family, what would you want it to be like?" She thought for a moment, her eyes distant. "I don't know," she replied finally. "I guess I'd like someone who's kind, someone who doesn't leave." Her voice wavered slightly on the last word, and she quickly looked away. James's heart clenched. He wanted to tell her right then and there that she wouldn't be alone, that he would never leave, but he knew it was too soon, that he couldn't make promises until he was certain. Instead, he reached out, resting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes, Ava, the people who love us the most are the ones who stay, even when we don't realize it right away." She looked at him then, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite place, a silent acknowledgement that went beyond her years. That evening, as James drove home, he made a decision. He couldn't keep delaying. If there was even a chance that Ava was his daughter, he had to take action. He'd already spoken to Mrs. Wilkes about the possibility of adopting her, and though the process would take time, he felt a glimmer of hope knowing he was one step closer to giving her a real family. His family. The next day, he took the first official steps toward adoption. The paperwork was overwhelming, the bureaucracy a labyrinth of rules and requirements. But James tackled each document with a sense of purpose. This was no longer just about finding answers. It was about securing a future for Ava, a future where she'd never have to wonder if she was wanted or loved. He shared the news with Elliot, who was cautiously optimistic. "You're making a big commitment. James, are you ready for that?" "Yes," James replied without hesitation. "More than anything, I want to make sure she's safe and loved. And maybe along the way, we'll find out the truth about her." After his call with Elliot, he visited Ava that afternoon with a new sense of purpose. She greeted him with her usual shy smile. But today he noticed an extra sparkle in her eyes, a hint of anticipation. They spent the afternoon as they usually did, talking, laughing, and simply being together. And for the first time, James allowed himself to imagine what life could be like if Ava really was his daughter. The possibility filled him with a quiet joy, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. And as he watched Ava laugh at one of his stories, he felt a profound sense of peace, as if he had finally found the missing piece of his heart. But deep down, he knew the journey was far from over. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many mysteries surrounding Ava's past and Rebecca's disappearance. And while he had hope, he also knew that the truth, whatever it might be, could change everything. James's steps were quick and purposeful as he arrived at the orphanage, a mixture of determination and anxiety swirling within him. He decided the adoption process was officially underway. He was committed to bringing Ava home, to giving her the family she deserved. But as much as he wanted to focus on their future together, a lingering unease about her past gnawed at him. He needed answers, and he needed them soon. Inside, Mrs. Wilkes greeted him warmly, noting his more frequent visits with an approving smile. "Ava will be thrilled to see you," she said, gesturing toward the playroom where Ava was waiting. "She's been talking about you non-stop." James's heart swelled at her words. He knew he was growing attached to Ava, but hearing that she felt the same way filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He entered the playroom quietly, watching as she sat cross-legged on the floor, her attention fixed on a jigsaw puzzle. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit up. "Hi, Mr. Miller." She greeted him with a wide grin, abandoning the puzzle and running over to hug him. "Hey, Ava," he replied, hugging her back. The affection felt as natural as breathing. He took a seat beside her, and they quickly fell into a comfortable rhythm, working on the puzzle together. The time passed easily, but as they finished, James knew he needed to discuss something important. "Ava," he began, carefully choosing his words. "How would you feel if I could be there for you every day, if you had a place to call home?" She looked at him, her green eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Do you mean, like a family?" "Yes," he said, his voice soft but steady. "A family, one that would always be there for you." Ava's face broke into a smile, but he could see the hint of hesitation behind her happiness, as if she were afraid to hope too much. I think I'd like that a lot," she whispered, clutching her pendant as if it were a lifeline. James reached out, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "I promise, Ava. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you never feel alone again." As the day wound down, he said his goodbyes, assuring Ava that he'd be back soon. Stepping outside, he dialed Elliot's number, hoping for an update on his investigation. After a few rings, Elliot picked up, his voice tense but focused. "James, I was just about to call you. I have something you'll want to hear." "Go on," James said, feeling his pulse quicken. "I went through the records again, and I found something unusual. Ava was brought to the orphanage, as you know, but her records were filed under a temporary name. There was no paperwork about who brought her in, and no records about her origin. But that's not all." Elliot paused, his tone sharpening. "The week before she was found, there was a missing persons report filed for a woman matching Rebecca's description. The police report was closed the following week, with no further information. It's almost as if it was brushed under the rug." James felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you think someone was covering it up?" "It's a strong possibility," Elliot replied. "And it's suspicious. Whoever was involved went to a lot of trouble to ensure no one could trace Ava's origins. The missing persons report for Rebecca might be a key piece of this puzzle." James's mind raced, questions flooding his thoughts. If Rebecca had been in New York around the time of Ava's arrival, why hadn't anyone contacted him? Why would someone make Ava disappear without a trace? Elliot continued, "I'm digging into some leads from that time, trying to track down anyone who might have known Rebecca or been connected to her during those weeks. But I have to warn you, James, these things can get messy. We're dealing with people who wanted this to stay buried." "I don't care how messy it gets," James replied firmly. "I want the truth. I want to know what happened to Rebecca, and I need to know if Ava is really my daughter." After the call, James took a deep breath, grounding himself as he looked up at the Chicago skyline. The path he'd started was leading him toward answers, but he could feel the weight of each step, the uncertainty that seemed to grow heavier with each new revelation. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, as if his search for truth had triggered an invisible alarm in the days that followed. The adoption paperwork progressed, albeit slowly, each delay testing his patience. But every obstacle only strengthened his resolve. The quiet moments he spent with Ava, her laughter, her small, thoughtful questions, the trust that was growing between them, solidified his decision. Whatever the truth was, he would be there for her. One evening, while they were reading together in the orphanage's library, Ava suddenly looked up, her face serious. "Mr. Miller, do you think someone will take me away?" James felt his heart tighten. He reached out, gently taking her small hand in his. "No, Ava, no one is going to take you away, not as long as I'm here." She gave a small nod, but her expression remained thoughtful. "Sometimes I feel like there's something I don't remember, like a part of me is missing." Her words pierced through him, resonating with his own search for answers. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain why he felt such a connection to her, but he knew it was still too soon. Instead, he gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." The next day, Elliot called again, this time with an unmistakable urgency in his voice. "James, I've uncovered something huge. I tracked down someone who used to work at a private hospital just outside of New York. They remember a woman matching Rebecca's description being admitted around the same time Ava was found. She was treated for trauma and was discharged a week later. But here's the twist. She left under a different name. It was almost like someone didn't want her identity traced." James gripped the phone, barely able to contain the storm of emotions churning within him. "Are you saying Rebecca might have been alive after she disappeared?" "It's possible," Elliot replied, his voice cautious. "If this woman was indeed Rebecca, then someone went to great lengths to keep her hidden, and Ava's presence at the orphanage could be directly tied to that. Whoever orchestrated this wanted to erase both of them from your life." The implications hit James like a tidal wave. If Rebecca had been alive, if someone had kept her away from him, then this mystery was darker and more twisted than he'd ever imagined. And Ava, she might truly be his daughter, left abandoned in a calculated, deliberate act meant to sever their family. "Who would do this?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm working on that," Elliot replied. "But James, be careful. If someone went to such lengths back then, they might not be too pleased that you're uncovering the truth now." James nodded, his jaw clenched. Whoever was responsible, whatever dark forces were behind this, he wouldn't stop until he uncovered every last piece of the truth. As he hung up the phone, a fierce determination ignited within him. His heart was heavy with the weight of the discoveries, but his resolve was stronger than ever. Ava was not only a part of his future, she was a link to his past, a past he was now determined to reclaim. James could barely contain his anticipation as he approached the orphanage that morning. The adoption paperwork had finally gone through, and today, he'd be able to tell Ava that she could come home with him. The weight of the last few weeks felt lighter as he thought of giving her the stability and love she deserved. Yet, a sense of apprehension lingered, a reminder of the unanswered questions and the mystery surrounding her past. And, possibly Rebecca's fate, inside the orphanage. Mrs. Wilkes greeted him with a knowing smile. "She's waiting for you," she said warmly, nodding toward the common room. "Ava's been talking about you nonstop. I don't think I've ever seen her this excited." James's heart swelled at her words. He entered the room quietly, spotting Ava sitting by the window, her eyes focused intently on the book in her lap. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit up, and she set her book aside, rushing over to him. "Mr. Miller," she exclaimed, her smile wide. "Hey, Ava," he replied, bending down to meet her gaze. "I've got something important to tell you." Ava's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "What is it?" James took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Ava, how would you feel about coming to live with me? To have a home, a real home, together?" She stared at him, her mouth opening in a little gasp, her hands going to the locket around her neck. "You mean, like a family?" "Yes, exactly," he replied, his voice gentle but filled with conviction. "A family, you and me together." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her lips curling into a shy smile. "I'd like that a lot." James wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a hug, and in that moment, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Ava hugged him tightly, as though afraid he might disappear, and he silently promised himself that he would never let her feel abandoned again. Whatever had happened in the past, he would ensure she felt safe, secure, and loved. Later that evening, after the paperwork was finalized and arrangements had been made, James brought Ava home. The drive back was quiet, with Ava looking out the window, her gaze drifting over the Chicago skyline, her face a mixture of awe and nervousness. James glanced at her occasionally, trying to reassure her with a gentle smile. Once they arrived, he showed her around the house. Ava seemed both curious and hesitant, trailing her fingers along the polished wood furniture and glancing at the framed pictures on the walls. James noticed her lingering in front of a particular photograph, a picture of Rebecca and him on one of their anniversaries, both of them beaming, lost in each other's gaze. "That's your wife, right?" Ava asked softly, glancing at him. James nodded, his throat tightening. "Yes, that's Rebecca. She was very special." Ava's gaze softened as she looked at the photo. "I think she would have liked me," she said, almost in a whisper. James's heart clenched at her words, his mind swirling with the hope that perhaps Rebecca would have not only liked her, but might also be her mother. He wanted to tell Ava everything, but he held back, sensing that the moment wasn't right. Instead, he knelt down beside her. "Ava, there's something I want you to know," he began, his tone gentle but serious. "This place, our home, it's yours now too. You don't ever have to worry about being alone again." She looked at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. "Promise, promise," he replied, reaching out to squeeze her hand. They shared a quiet moment, and James realized how much he already cared for her, how deeply she had managed to etch herself into his life. As the evening went on, they settled into a routine, a sense of normalcy forming between them. James cooked dinner, trying not to laugh at Ava's delight over the simplest things. The big kitchen, the garden visible from the window, the way the lights cast a warm glow over the room. They talked about her favorite books, her favorite games, her friends at the orphanage, and each word drew them closer. But later that night, as he was tucking her into bed, Ava looked up at him with a serious expression. "Mr. Miller," she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You can call me James, you know," he replied, smiling down at her. "Or, well, whatever you feel comfortable with." "Okay, James," she said softly, her hand nervously clutching her locket again. "Do you think I had a family before?" The question caught him off guard, and he felt a lump form in his throat. He'd anticipated it, of course, but hearing it from her mouth was different. She looked up at him with those deep green eyes, eyes that mirrored his own unspoken questions. "I think sometimes life can be complicated," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And sometimes people get lost, but it doesn't mean they don't care or that they don't love you." She seemed to mull over his words, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "So, maybe they didn't leave on purpose." "Maybe," James replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes things happen that we don't understand, things that make it hard for people to stay." Ava nodded, as if this answer brought her some comfort. She looked down, her fingers fiddling with her locket. "I always thought this locket was important, like it was a part of me." James reached out, gently holding the locket in his hand. "I think it is, and I think it might be a part of someone who loved you very much." They shared a quiet moment, and James could feel the weight of the unspoken questions lingering in the air. Questions that were perhaps beyond words for a child her age. He tucked her in, brushing a stray curl from her forehead, his heart filled with a fierce protectiveness. He knew he would do anything to protect her, to shield her from the pain of the unknown. As he left her room, he felt a swell of determination rise within him. He couldn't leave the questions about Ava's past unanswered. Not for her, and not for himself. He needed closure, not only for the sake of Rebecca's memory, but for the future he was building with Ava. Whatever dark secrets might lie ahead, he was ready to face them. That night, as James sat alone in his study, his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen and saw Elliot's name. His heart skipped a beat as he picked up the phone, bracing himself for whatever news his friend had uncovered. "James?" Elliot's voice was low, tense, carrying the weight of something significant. "I think I've found something you need to hear." James swallowed, his mind racing. "Go on," he said, his voice steady despite the anticipation brewing inside him. "Rebecca. She might be alive." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. James felt the room spin as he tried to process what he'd just heard. Alive? Could it be possible after all these years? After all the dead ends? The hopeless nights spent searching? He struggled to speak, his voice catching in his throat. Are you sure?" "There's more," Elliot continued, his tone grim. "I've uncovered evidence that suggests someone close to you may have been involved in her disappearance. I think you should sit down for this, James. It's about Patrick." James's blood ran cold. Patrick, his own brother, the same brother who had been his closest confidant after Rebecca vanished, who had offered him comfort during his darkest moments. The betrayal, if true, was unfathomable. "James, I believe Patrick orchestrated Rebecca's disappearance," Elliot said, his voice hard and resolute. "And he may have been using Ava as a pawn in his game to keep Rebecca away from you all these years." James felt his world collapse in that moment. The room seemed to close in around him, his breath shallow and unsteady. He clenched his fists, the weight of the revelation hitting him like a punch to the gut. Rebecca was alive somewhere, and Ava, his Ava, was at the center of a twisted conspiracy that had stolen years from them. His heart broke as he realized the extent of Patrick's cruelty, the pain and loss he'd inflicted on their family. But one thing was clear: James was done being manipulated. The truth was within his reach, and he would stop at nothing to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him, to reunite with Rebecca, and to ensure Ava would never again be used as a pawn in anyone's game. The pieces were finally coming together, and he knew that the confrontation that awaited him would be his hardest yet. But for Ava, for Rebecca, and for the family they could have had, he would face whatever lay ahead. James sat in the dark of his study, his mind reeling from the revelation Elliot had dropped on him. Patrick, the one person who had stayed by his side, who had been his confidant through all the years of Rebecca's absence, had orchestrated her disappearance. And somehow, Ava, the girl he now considered his daughter, was entangled in this twisted scheme. Betrayal washed over him, mingling with an anger he could barely contain. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to call Patrick right then and demand an explanation. But he knew he had to proceed carefully. He dialed Elliot again, his hand trembling slightly as he held the phone. "Elliot, I need to know everything. I need to know exactly how Patrick did this, where Rebecca is, and why he would involve Ava." Elliot's voice came through the line, calm but grave. "I've been piecing things together, James. From what I've uncovered, it seems Patrick's motive was rooted in jealousy. He resented the life you built with Rebecca, the success you achieved. But it wasn't just that. He was obsessed with her, fixated in a way that turned dangerous. When he realized he couldn't have what you had, he decided to take it from you." James's stomach twisted at the thought. He could hardly fathom the depth of his brother's betrayal. The pieces began to fall into place. Patrick's steady support, his advice to move on, his subtle encouragement to let go of his search for Rebecca. Every word, every gesture now felt poisoned, tainted by his brother's hidden intentions. "But why Ava?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Patrick needed a way to control Rebecca," Elliot explained. "After he staged her disappearance, he kept her isolated, making her believe you had moved on, that you'd never find her. But he knew that wasn't enough. He needed leverage to keep her from trying to escape. From looking for you," the realization dawned on James with horrifying clarity. "He used Ava." "Yes," Elliot confirmed grimly. "I believe Patrick led Rebecca to believe that if she ever tried to find you, it would put Ava's life in danger. It was a form of psychological imprisonment. She was too afraid to take any action, believing her own daughter would suffer the consequences." James's heart shattered at the thought of Rebecca, alone and helpless, trapped by her love for Ava and her fear of putting her child in danger. The weight of the situation hit him like a tidal wave, nearly knocking the breath out of him. He had to confront Patrick, to end this nightmare that had stolen years from their lives. "I need to find Rebecca," James said, his voice laced with urgency. "I need to bring her back. I'm working on it." Elliot replied. "I've traced a few possible locations where Patrick might be keeping her. But James, confronting Patrick won't be easy. He'll do everything he can to protect himself." "I don't care," James replied firmly. "I'm done playing his game. This ends now." The next morning, James prepared himself. He'd barely slept, and his mind was clouded with a mixture of dread and determination. Ava was still asleep, curled up in her bed, blissfully unaware of the turmoil raging beneath the surface. He left a note for her, assuring her he'd be back soon and that she was safe, hoping to shield her from the dark truth he was about to uncover. With Elliot's directions, James drove to a secluded property just outside the city, a place Patrick had been known to use for business retreats. The drive felt endless, his grip tight on the steering wheel as he rehearsed the confrontation in his mind. His anger simmered just beneath the surface, but he knew he had to stay calm if he wanted answers. When he arrived, he found Patrick waiting for him on the front steps, his face a mask of cool confidence that James now saw as a lie. "James!" Patrick greeted him with a smirk. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Cut the act, Patrick," James spat, his voice filled with contempt. "I know everything. I know what you did to Rebecca. I know how you kept her from me, and I know you used Ava to control her." Patrick's face remained impassive, though a flicker of irritation passed through his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop lying," James demanded, his voice growing louder. "I trusted you, Patrick. You were my brother, my family, and you betrayed me in the worst way possible." Patrick's expression hardened, the facade of brotherly affection fading. "I did what I had to do, James. You were always the golden boy, always getting everything handed to you and Rebecca. She was supposed to be mine, but you took her, like you took everything else." James's fists clenched, his entire body tense with rage. "You destroyed our lives because of some twisted jealousy. You're a monster." Patrick's gaze turned cold, almost amused. "Call me what you want, but Rebecca was never yours to keep. She belongs with me, and I won't let you take her away." "I'm not here to argue with you, Patrick," James replied, his voice steady despite the fire in his veins. "I'm here to end this," without warning. Patrick lunged at him, fists swinging. James dodged, feeling a surge of adrenaline as he countered, grabbing Patrick by the collar and pinning him against the wall. "Where is she?" James demanded, his voice a low growl. "Where's Rebecca?" Patrick sneered, refusing to answer, but James tightened his grip, his voice filled with a desperation he couldn't contain. "You're going to tell me, or so help me. I'll make sure you pay for everything you've done." Patrick's defiance wavered, his gaze flickering with a hint of fear. "Fine," he spat, his voice dripping with bitterness. "She's in a private facility, under a different name, but you'll never find her." James let him go, stepping back in disgust. "You can keep your lies, Patrick. I'll find her with or without you." As James turned to leave, Patrick called after him, his voice laced with contempt. "You think you can just walk back into her life? After everything, she'll never forgive you for abandoning her." James paused, a lump forming in his throat. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, that the years of separation and manipulation might have left scars that would take a lifetime to heal, but he couldn't give up now. Rebecca needed him. And Ava, whether she was their daughter or not, deserved the truth. When he returned to his car, Elliot's voice came through the phone, calm but urgent. "James, I've got the location. I'll meet you there." The drive to the facility was a blur, his mind focused only on Rebecca, on finally reuniting with her after all these years. As they approached the facility, a small, secluded building surrounded by tall fences, he felt his heart racing. This was it, the moment he had dreamed of, hoped for, even when all hope seemed lost. Inside, they were directed to a quiet room, and there, sitting by the window, was Rebecca. Her hair had grown longer, streaked with silver, and her face was thinner, etched with lines of sorrow and strength. But when she turned and saw him, her green eyes widened in recognition, and in that instant, all the years melted away. "James," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. He took a step forward, tears filling his eyes. "Rebecca, it's me." In a moment, they were in each other's arms, years of heartache and separation dissolving in that embrace. She clung to him, her hands trembling, her voice breaking as she whispered his name over and over, as though afraid he might vanish. "I thought I'd lost you," she murmured, pulling back to look into his eyes. I thought you'd moved on." "Never," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent every day searching for you, hoping for this moment." They held each other, each breath a reminder of the love that had endured despite Patrick's cruelty, despite the years they'd lost. But as the reality of their reunion set in, James knew there was still one more truth to share. "Rebecca," he said gently, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. "There's someone waiting for you, Ava. She's our daughter." Her eyes filled with tears as the realization sank in, and James knew, in that moment, that they would rebuild their lives together, no matter the cost. As they left the facility hand in hand, James felt a sense of closure, a peace he hadn't known in years. He had Rebecca back, and Ava would finally know the love of her mother, and together, they would begin the long journey of healing and rebuilding, proving that love and family could triumph, even in the face of the deepest betrayal. James's heart raced as he and Rebecca entered the house, each step heavy with anticipation. He could hardly believe that this moment was finally happening. After all the years of separation, loss, and longing, he was about to reunite his family. Ava had no idea of the monumental moment awaiting her, of the reunion that would change her life forever. As they stepped inside, the soft hum of classical music played from the living room. Ava was curled up on the couch, a book open in her lap, her face serene as she immersed herself in the story. When she looked up and saw James, her face lit up with the familiar warmth that had become his greatest comfort. But then she noticed Rebecca standing beside him, her expression shifting to one of curiosity and surprise. "Hi, Ava," James said gently, doing his best to keep his voice steady. "There's someone very special I'd like you to meet." Ava's gaze moved from James to Rebecca, her small face filling with a mix of emotions, confusion, wonder, and a hint of recognition. She clutched her locket, the same one Rebecca wore, as if sensing something profound that she couldn't quite grasp. "Hello, Ava," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper, filled with years of unshed tears and unspoken love. She took a small step forward, her hands trembling. I'm your mother." Ava blinked, her mouth slightly open, processing the words. She looked from Rebecca to James, then back to Rebecca, her hand still clutching the locket. "My mother," she whispered, almost as if she were afraid to believe it. Rebecca nodded, her eyes misting as she knelt to Ava's level, reaching out with a trembling hand. "Yes, sweetheart. I've missed you so much. I've dreamed of this moment for so long." Ava's lips trembled as she took a cautious step forward, then another, until she was close enough to touch. She looked deeply into Rebecca's eyes, her own glistening with unshed tears. And then, as if some invisible barrier shattered, she threw her arms around Rebecca, clinging to her with all the strength her small body could muster. Rebecca held her tightly, her tears falling freely now as she whispered words of love, comfort, and promises that she would never leave her again. James stood nearby, watching with a full heart as his family, fractured for so long, finally came together in a moment of pure, unfiltered love. Ava's voice came in soft sobs. I thought I didn't have a family." Rebecca pulled back just enough to look into her daughter's eyes, her hands cradling Ava's face. "You've always had a family, Ava, even when I couldn't be there. I loved you every moment. And now, we're together again. Forever." Ava nodded, her small face beaming through her tears as she turned to James, her voice soft and hopeful. "Does this mean we're all together now?" James knelt beside them, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Yes, Ava, we're a family, and no one will ever take that away from us." They sat together, the three of them entwined in a hug that felt both like a reunion and a new beginning. James listened as Rebecca and Ava shared stories, each filling in pieces of the life they had missed, the laughter and tears creating a bond that would only grow stronger. As night fell, Ava eventually grew tired, her head resting against Rebecca's shoulder. James carried her to her room, tucking her into bed, and as he looked down at her sleeping face, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. His daughter was home, safe, and with her mother by her side, When he returned to the living room, he found Rebecca waiting, her eyes still shimmering with emotion. They embraced, each silent but grateful for the miracle of this moment. They knew there would be challenges ahead, but together, they could face anything. For the first time in years, James felt whole. He had his family back, and the future was finally something to look forward to, filled with hope, love, and the promise of new beginnings. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across the room, James sat with Rebecca at the dining table, a sense of calm mingling with the urgency that had returned to his heart. The reunion with Ava had been everything he'd hoped for, but now, with the truth about Patrick's betrayal heavy on his mind, he knew there was unfinished business to attend to. Rebecca looked at him, her eyes tired but determined. "We need to face Patrick. James, he's taken so much from us. I need him to see that he didn't break us, that we're stronger than he thought." James nodded, feeling a similar fire ignite within him. He had spent years mourning, doubting, and searching, all while Patrick had manipulated their lives from the shadows. It was time to confront him, to put an end to his lies and ensure that he could never threaten their family again. Together, they reached out to Elliot, arranging a meeting with Patrick. James was done with secrets, done with hidden agendas. He wanted to look his brother in the eye, to demand answers, and to make sure justice was served. When they arrived at the location Elliot had set up, a private office on the edge of town, James took Rebecca's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. She returned his gaze with a strength that filled him with pride. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, the mother of his child, and together, they were about to confront the man who had tried to tear them apart. Inside, Patrick was already waiting. He sat casually in a chair, his face as unreadable as ever, but James could see the flicker of unease in his eyes when he saw Rebecca standing beside him. Patrick's confident facade wavered as he registered the determination on both their faces. "James, Rebecca," he greeted them with a strained smile, his voice attempting to maintain the usual smugness. "I didn't expect to see you both together. You thought wrong." James cut him off, his voice cold and steady. "We know everything, Patrick, about how you took Rebecca, how you manipulated her, and how you used Ava to keep her from me. The lies, the deception. It's all over." Patrick's face hardened, the mask of brotherly affection vanishing as he realized there was no escape from the truth. "I did what I had to do," he sneered, his voice laced with bitterness. "You always had everything handed to you. Success, happiness, Rebecca's love. I was the one left in the shadows, while you built the perfect life." Rebecca's eyes flashed with anger as she took a step forward. "That doesn't excuse what you did. You stole years from us. You took away my family, made me believe I'd never see James again, and used my own child to manipulate me. You're nothing but a coward." Patrick laughed bitterly, though the edge in his voice betrayed his frustration. "You still don't get it, do you? I loved you, Rebecca. I would have given you everything. But you chose him. You chose James, just like everyone else." James clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. "You didn't love her, Patrick. Love doesn't imprison or control. You only wanted power, and when you couldn't have it, you destroyed our lives out of spite." Patrick's gaze flickered with something darker, a hint of desperation. "So, what now, James? You think you can just walk in here and play the hero? Do you really think she'll forgive you for not finding her sooner?" Rebecca stepped forward, her voice steady and filled with resolve. "Patrick, this isn't about forgiveness. This is about making sure you can never hurt us again." At that moment, Elliot entered the room, holding a stack of documents. He looked at Patrick, his expression stern. "We have everything we need to make sure justice is served. The evidence we've gathered is enough to hold you accountable for years of manipulation, emotional abuse, and kidnapping." Patrick's face paled as he glanced at the documents. He seemed to realize the gravity of the situation, the walls closing in around him. His confidence faded, replaced by a simmering anger as he glared at James and Rebecca. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You may think you've won, but I'll find a way to make you pay." James held Rebecca's hand tighter, his voice calm but resolute. "No, Patrick, this is the end. You won't come near my family again." Security arrived shortly after, escorting Patrick from the room. His threats faded into silence, leaving James and Rebecca standing side by side. The weight of his betrayal finally lifted, for the first time. They felt a sense of closure, knowing that the man who had stolen so much from them would never have the power to do it again. When they returned home, Ava was waiting, her face lighting up as she ran to greet them. James lifted her into his arms, feeling the familiar warmth and joy that she brought into their lives. Rebecca wrapped her arms around them both, the three of them standing together, finally free from the shadows of the past. That evening, as they sat together, sharing stories and laughter, James felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Their family was whole, and the future, once filled with uncertainty, was now a place of hope and promise. As they looked toward the horizon, James knew that, together, they could face anything, and that the strength of their love and resilience would guide them forward, no matter what lay ahead. In the days that followed their confrontation with Patrick, a new chapter began for James. Rebecca and Ava, the weight that had once filled their home seemed to lift, replaced by a peace they had all longed for. The rooms of the house were now filled with laughter, the soft murmur of conversations, and the comforting sounds of a family finding its way back to each other. James found joy in the small moments, Rebecca humming as she prepared breakfast, Ava's giggles echoing from her room, the shared smiles that now felt effortless. Each day was a step toward healing, a chance to build the family life they had been robbed of for so long. One morning, as sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, Rebecca poured herself a cup of coffee and joined James at the table. Ava was still asleep, and the house was quiet. They hadn't had a moment to themselves since everything had unfolded, and James welcomed the chance to speak openly with her. Rebecca wrapped her hands around her mug, her gaze drifting thoughtfully. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a dream," she said softly. "After everything that happened, it's hard to believe we're really here, together." James reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I know what you mean. There were days I thought we'd never have this chance. But now that we do, I want us to make the most of it." She smiled, nodding as she looked down at their joined hands. "We've been given a second chance, and I'm so grateful for it. I want Ava to know that we're here for her, that this is her family." James could see the strength and determination in Rebecca's eyes, the love that had kept her going even through the hardest moments. He knew that her presence was a source of healing for Ava, who had spent so many years wondering if she would ever have a family of her own. That afternoon, they planned a small outing to a nearby park. The air was fresh and crisp, the trees just beginning to show hints of spring. Ava was delighted, her energy contagious as she raced ahead, her laughter filling the air. They played, explored, and shared stories, each moment a new memory that filled the empty spaces left by the years they had lost. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Ava settled beside them on a park bench, her gaze thoughtful. "I like it when we're all together," she said, her voice soft but filled with contentment. "It feels safe." Rebecca wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "That's because we are together, Ava, and we're not going anywhere. You'll always have a place with us." Ava looked up at them, her eyes shining with a mixture of joy and relief. "Promise," James and Rebecca both nodded, their voices in unison. "Promise." The three of them sat together. As the last rays of sunlight bathed them in a warm glow, James felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, knowing they had come through the darkness stronger, more united. He looked at Rebecca, then at Ava, realizing that the future they were building together was filled with the kind of love and resilience that would carry them forward. As they made their way back home that evening, James felt the calm certainty that, despite everything they had endured, they were exactly where they were meant to be. The arrival of spring brought a sense of renewal to their lives. Each morning, sunlight would stream into the house, filling it with warmth and brightness. James, Rebecca, and Ava settled into a comforting routine, each day filled with laughter, shared meals, and quiet moments that they all cherished. The scars of the past were healing, slowly but surely, as they embraced the life they were building together. One weekend, they decided to celebrate their new beginning by going on a family outing to the lake. Ava was ecstatic, bubbling with excitement as they packed a picnic basket, brought along her favorite storybook, and even packed a kite for her to fly. It was a day for joy, for creating memories to replace the shadows of the past. The lake was calm, the water shimmering under the warm spring sun. Ava ran along the shore, her laughter echoing as she raced against the wind with her kite soaring behind her. James and Rebecca watched, their hands clasped together, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace as they took in the sight of their daughter's happiness. Rebecca looked at James, her gaze soft with gratitude. "I never thought we'd have this, James. I almost gave up hope, but being here with you and Ava, I feel like we've been given a gift." James nodded, his heart swelling. "We have, and I don't want to waste a moment of it. This is our life now, a real one, filled with the love we always dreamed of." They spent the afternoon sharing stories, laughing, and making plans for the future. Ava, sensing the joy in her parents, would occasionally pause to watch them, her face lighting up with a smile that spoke of belonging. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she truly had a family that would stand by her no matter what. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, Ava snuggled up to her parents, her little hand resting in James's. She looked up at him, her expression serious but filled with warmth. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for finding me, for bringing us together." James felt his heart swell, overcome with love and gratitude. "You brought us together, Ava. You're the heart of this family, and we're so lucky to have you." Rebecca pulled her close, her eyes misting as she hugged her daughter. "We love you so much, Ava. We always will." That evening, as they drove home, James felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The years of searching, the pain of loss, the ache of betrayal, all of it had led them to this moment, where love had triumphed over darkness. Together, they would move forward, building a future filled with warmth, happiness, and the promise of new memories. As they returned to the comfort of their home, James knew that they had finally found their way back to each other, and as he held Rebecca's hand, he knew that their journey, though filled with hardships, had been worth every step. Their family was whole, and the future was theirs to create, a future built on resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond that would carry them through whatever life held.